Kara Jackson, 34, strode through the glass doors of Meridian Airlines headquarters at Chicago's O'Hare International Airport on a frigid December morning. The wind off Lake Michigan carried an icy bite, but she barely noticed, her veins pulsing with adrenaline. With over 15,000 flight hours logged across 5 continents, from grueling military transport missions in Afghanistan to intricate commercial routes, she was one of the youngest pilots ever promoted to senior captain at Meridian, a storied airline once synonymous with the American dream. Her uniform fit like a second skin, the 4 gold stripes on her sleeves glinting under the fluorescent lights. A silent testament to her skill and pride. Kara pulled her pilot's case with her right hand, glancing at her watch with the left. 5:15 a.m. The briefing for Flight MA-27 to San Francisco was set to start in 15 minutes, and she was primed to make her mark on her first day with the company. Little did she know that within moments, the door to the opportunity she'd fought her entire life to open would slam shut in her face, not with a polite nudge, but with a public humiliation that would ignite a firestorm. The crew briefing room was packed when Kara stepped inside, the air thick with hushed chatter and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee. 6 flight attendants sat around the table, scrolling through phones or reviewing flight plans, while Liam Tran, a 27-year-old first officer with bright eyes and a warm smile, rose to greet her. "Captain Jackson," he said, extending a hand. "I've heard about you for ages. It's an honor to fly with you today." His voice carried the genuine excitement of a young pilot eager to prove himself. Kara returned the smile, about to respond, when the door swung open again, cutting the moment short. Victor Langston, the 58-year-old executive operations director, loomed in the doorway like a specter of authority, tall and imposing. His salt and pepper hair swept back meticulously. His steel-cold eyes scanned the room. Behind him trailed Phil Grayson, the Czech captain, sporting a faint smirk that never reached his gaze. The room's energy shifted instantly. Conversation died. All eyes locked on Langston. He stood at the center, not bothering to sit, and his voice boomed like a gavel. "Jackson, I'm afraid there's been a mix-up. You're not commanding this flight." Kara's brow furrowed, a hot prickling sensation creeping up her spine, but she kept her tone steady, sharp as a honed blade. "I was officially scheduled 3 weeks ago, Mr. Langston. This is Flight MA-27 to San Francisco, per my assignment." She stood tall, hands relaxed but fists subtly clenched, ready for a fight. Langston let out a dry, scornful chuckle, the sound dripping with contempt, as if her presence were a punchline. "You might fly well somewhere else, Jackson, but this is Meridian. We need someone who actually knows how we run things here, not some newcomer expecting to take the captain's seat. Grayson's taking this one. You get out there and wait until we decide if you're worth keeping around." Snickers erupted from a few corners of the room, each one a tiny dagger to her pride. Kara's gaze swept the faces, Liam's quiet sympathy, the curious stares of a few attendants, and then a low, venomous voice cut through from the back. Edward Ed Carver, 63, a grizzled veteran with snow-white hair and a face carved from granite, rose from his chair, jabbing a finger in her direction. "Don't argue, Jackson," he growled, each word a slap. "This isn't the place for people like you to stir up trouble. Get out now or I'll have security drag you out. We don't need more headaches from rabble-rousers." The room fell deathly silent, the tension so thick it could choke. Kara felt the blood rush to her face, her heart pounding like a war drum, but she refused to let them see her falter. 20 years in aviation, from passengers demanding a different pilot because of her skin to sleepless nights mastering protocols in the military, had forged her into steel. She locked eyes with Langston, then Carver, her stare not a challenge but a vow. They'd just lit a fuse they couldn't snuff out. "Very well," she said, her voice even but icy, "I'll step outside. But you'll see me back soon, not to wait, but to make you beg for my mercy." She turned, pulling her case behind her, the wheels clatter on the floor echoing like a drumroll signaling war. Outside in the hallway, the dim light from the windows cast shadows across Kara's face, illuminating her deep brown eyes ablaze with resolve. She leaned against the wall, drawing a deep breath to cool the rage simmering within, letting it sharpen into calculation. Her father's words, spoken by a retired aerospace engineer, rang in her ears. "You've got to be twice as good to get half the credit, Kara. But never let them make you doubt your worth." A faint smile tugged at her lips as she pulled out her phone, firing off a quick text to her sister Nia. "Day one's a battlefield. Call me tonight. Need a plan." Kara knew this wasn't just a personal slight, it was a gauntlet thrown by Meridian. A dare that she didn't belong. They were wrong. She didn't just belong to the sky. She'd make the world see the sky belonged to her too. And if Meridian thought they could shove her aside without consequence, they were about to face a storm with her at its helm. The sting of Victor Langston's words and Ed Carver's threat still burned in Kara Jackson's chest as she stood in the frigid hallway outside the briefing room, the echo of her rolling case fading into silence. At 34, she'd faced discrimination before, skeptical passengers, snide remarks about her place in the cockpit, but this was different. A calculated ambush meant to break her on day one. She exhaled sharply, her breath fogging in the chilled air, and straightened her shoulders. Meridian might think they'd won this round. But Kara wasn't here to play their game, she'd rewrite the rules. Moments later, Liam Tran, the 27-year-old first officer, slipped out of the room, his youthful face tight with discomfort. "Captain Jackson," he whispered, glancing down the hall to ensure they were alone. "That was bullshit. They're saying it's standard procedure for new captains. But I've been here 2 years. No one's ever been pulled like that on their first flight." Kara's eyes narrowed, her mind already piecing together the puzzle. "Who's taking my seat now?" she asked. Liam hesitated, then muttered, "Carver. They've reassigned you to Shadow Flight 422 to Seattle with him. Short hop, supposedly to acclimate you." The name hit her like a punch. Edward Carver. Meridian's most senior captain, a 63-year-old relic notorious for his vocal disdain for outsiders in the pilot ranks. Kara's lips pressed into a thin line. "I see," she said, her voice low and steely. "Thanks, Liam. Keep your eyes open up there." He nodded, a flicker of solidarity in his gaze, before retreating. Kara's phone buzzed, a text from her sister Nia. "Knock 'em dead, sis." So proud. She stared at it, a storm of pride and fury churning inside her. She'd come too far to be sidelined. Flight 422 would be her proving ground, or her breaking point. The pre-flight ritual for the Seattle run unfolded in the shadow of Carver's towering presence. Kara sat in the jump seat of the Boeing 737, relegated to observer status. Her hands itching to grip the controls she'd earned the right to command. Carver barely acknowledged her. His curt nod a grudging concession as he ran through the checklist with First Officer Peter Lawson, a twitchy man in his 30s who darted apologetic glances her way but said nothing. The old captain's hands moved with the precision of decades, his gravelly voice barking orders, but his silence toward Kara was deafening, until the pushback from the gate. "I don't know where you came from, Jackson," he said without turning, his tone dripping with condescension, "but at Meridian we don't cut corners or play fast and loose. You do well to learn that." The jab was clear. He assumed she was sloppy, untested, unworthy. Kara bit back a retort, replying evenly, "I understand, Captain. Safety's the backbone of every flight I've ever flown." Carver grunted, unsatisfied that she didn't rise to his bait, and the plane taxied into the gray Chicago dawn. The short hop to Seattle should have been routine, just under 2 hours, but the sky had other plans. As they climbed through 20,000 feet, skirting the edge of a storm rolling off the Rockies, the cockpit shuddered with a sudden, bone-rattling boom. Alarms blared. "Engine 1's gone." Lawson yelped, his voice cracking as the plane lurched right. Carver's composure fractured. "Reduce thrust, stabilize her," he barked, but his hands fumbled the yoke, overcorrecting as the aircraft pitched violently. Lightning split the clouds outside, illuminating the panic on his weathered face. The altimeter spun downward, 22,000 feet, 21,000, 20,500, too fast, too steep. Kara's pulse hammered, her training kicking in like muscle memory. She saw it instantly. Carver had misjudged the trim, sending them into a spiral. "Captain, you're stalling us," she shouted, unbuckling from the jump seat. He whipped around, eyes wild. "Stay out of this, Jackson." But the plane didn't care for his pride. It bucked again, a sickening groan reverberating through the fuselage. Lawson froze, hands trembling over the controls. Kara didn't wait for permission. "I'm taking over," she roared, shoving past Carver and dropping into the captain's seat. Lawson, support me. Throttles to 70%, flaps 15, now." Her voice cut through the chaos like a blade, steady and commanding. Carver lunged to pull her back, but she elbowed him off, her focus locked on the instruments. The plane was bleeding altitude 18,000 feet, but she wrestled it level, rerouting power and silencing the alarms one by one. Denver Center, this is Meridian 422. Declaring an emergency, she snapped into the radio. Engine failure. Requesting immediate vectors for landing. The next 10 minutes were a blur of lightning, turbulence, and raw willpower. Kara's hands danced across the controls, her mind racing through every contingency she drilled in simulators and war zones. Lawson snapped out of his daze, following her orders with shaky precision, while Carver slumped in the jump seat, his authority stripped by the crisis he couldn't handle. The 737 broke through the storm's edge, Denver's runway lights glinting ahead like a lifeline. Kara guided the crippled bird down, the single engine whining in protest, and touched down with a jolt that rattled the cabin, but they were alive. 189 passengers, oblivious to how close they'd come to disaster, erupted in applause as the plane rolled to a stop. Kara exhaled, her knuckles white from gripping the yoke, and turned to Carver. His face was ashen, his pride shattered, but he managed a stiff, "Good catch, Jackson." She didn't smile. "It's not a catch when you let it fall first," she said coldly, unbuckling and standing. Lawson muttered a quiet thank you. But Carver's silence screamed louder as she stepped out of the cockpit, her uniform still pristine despite the chaos. Back at O'Hare that evening, the fallout hit fast. Meridian's brass, led by Langston, summoned Kara to a debriefing, but it wasn't a commendation. "You overstepped," Langston hissed across his polished desk, his 58-year-old frame radiating menace. Carver was in command. "Your stunt delayed our schedule and embarrassed a veteran captain." Kara leaned forward unflinching. "That veteran nearly killed us all. I saved your plane and your reputation. Check the black box if you doubt me." Langston's jaw tightened, but he waved her off. "You're on administrative duty until we sort this out. Don't push your luck, Jackson." She walked out, fury simmering beneath her calm exterior, and pulled out her phone. Nia answered on the first ring. "They're burying it, aren't they?" her sister asked. Lawyer-sharp instincts cutting through. "Yeah," Kara replied. "But I'm not. I need you to dig into Carver and Langston, anything dirty. This isn't just about me anymore." As she hung up, the memory of that spiraling plane fueled her resolve. Meridian had tried to break her, but they just handed her the match to burn them down. The aftermath of the Denver emergency clung to Kara Jackson like the static of a storm. At 34, she'd seen her share of close calls, dust-choked runways in Kabul, ice-slick descents into Reykjavik, but nothing compared to the betrayal she felt now. Meridian Airlines hadn't just sidelined her, they'd buried her heroics under a pile of lies, claiming the engine failure on Flight 422 was a weather-related anomaly and pinning the delay on her, unauthorized interference. By the time she returned to O'Hare, the whispers among the crew had morphed into a narrative. Kara was the reckless upstart who'd undermined Ed Carver's command. She sat in her sparse Chicago apartment that night, a glass of bourbon untouched on the table, replaying the day's chaos. The near crash wasn't a fluke, it was a symptom. Those maintenance logs she'd glimpsed before takeoff, with dates that didn't align and checks suspiciously skipped, gnawed at her. She opened her laptop, pulling up Meridian's public records, employee forums, anything that might hint at a deeper rot. What she found wasn't shocking, it was horrifying. Anonymous posts from mechanics and attendants painted a picture of rushed repairs, ignored defects, and a culture that punished anyone who spoke up. Kara's gut twisted. This wasn't just about her pride anymore, it was about the lives in her hands every time she flew. The next morning, Kara reported for her administrative reassignment, a punishment dressed up as protocol, shadowing a flight to Dallas under Captain Andrew Peterson, a reserved man in his late 40s who didn't share Carver's venom. Mid-flight, as they cruised at 35,000 feet, he broke the silence. "Not everyone agrees with how they're treating you, Jackson," he murmured, keeping his eyes on the horizon. "But it's complicated. Langston and Carver go way back 30 years. They protect their own." Kara studied him, sensing an opening. "Even if it risks safety," she pressed. Peterson's jaw tightened, a flicker of unease crossing his face. "Just watch yourself," he said, turning away. "Keep your eyes open." His cryptic warning lit a spark. Between flights, Kara slipped into the maintenance hangar under the guise of learning procedures, her restricted badge dangling like a scarlet letter. Most technicians brushed her off, their answers clipped and evasive, but one man lingered, Darius Holt, 45, a wiry black mechanic with tired eyes and a Detroit drawl that matched her own. "23 years keeping these birds aloft," he said, wrenching a bolt on an engine cowling. "Seen a lot change, none of it good lately." Kara leaned in, casual but probing. "How so?" Darius glanced around, then lowered his voice. "New management's pushing speed over safety. More flights, less downtime. Checks that used to be mandatory? Now it's technicians' discretion. I wouldn't let my kids fly some of these planes." Her blood ran cold, but she kept her face neutral. "That's a gray area legally, right?" Darius grimaced. "They've got slick lawyers who make it sound legit. But it ain't right." Before she could dig deeper, a supervisor loomed nearby, his stare slicing through their conversation. Darius clammed up, returning to his work, and Kara thanked him with a nod, her mind racing. Back in the crew lounge, Sophia Park, a sharp-eyed flight attendant with a quiet defiance, caught her alone. "I heard what you did on 422, Sophia said, her voice hushed. "I've got something you need to see." She slid her phone over a photo of a cracked cabin pressure valve from a Toronto flight. Dated weeks ago. Inspection failed, but they cleared it anyway. Said delaying would have cost too much. Kara's heart thudded. "You kept this?" Sophia nodded, fierce. "Months of it. I was scared to say anything until now." Kara scribbled a secure email on a napkin. "Send it all here." "And Sophia, thank you." The flight attendant's resolve mirrored her own. A fragile alliance forming in the shadows. Over the next 2 weeks, Kara became a ghost in Meridian's machine, enduring the grind of grunt assignments, red-eye flights, endless scrutiny, and Carver's lingering glares while piecing together a mosaic of corruption. She cataloged every discrepancy, a fuel line repaired with mismatched parts, a wing flap actuator overdue for replacement by 6 months, logs signed off by mechanics who'd been quietly fired or transferred. Liam Tran, her first ally, fed her snippets from the cockpit, overheard grumbles about cut corners, pressure from Langston to keep the schedule tight. Darius slipped her a USB drive one evening in the hangar, his hands trembling as he passed it over. "Flight logs, memos, proof they're downgrading structural issues," he muttered. "At least 30% of the fleet's unfit to fly, but they don't care." Kara's breath caught. "Why risk it?" Darius's eyes darkened. "Profit. And if you push back, you're gone. Look up Paul Decker, best mechanic I knew. Flagged engine mounts last year. Then fell off a platform. Broke his back. Company called it negligence, left him with nothing." The name seared into her brain, a casualty of Meridian's war on truth. That night, Kara spread her evidence across her apartment floor, Darius's files, Sophia's photos, her own notes, a map of a company rotting from the inside. She called Nia, her voice steady despite the hour. "It's worse than I thought," she said. "Systemic. They're flying death traps and silencing anyone who notices. I need your friend at the FAA, and a plan to take this public." Nia's lawyer instincts kicked in. "Send me everything. And Kara, watch your back. These bastards don't play fair." As she hung up, Kara stared at the USB drive, Paul Decker's fate echoing in her mind. She'd saved 189 lives in Denver, but how many more were at risk every day? The bourbon finally touched her lips, its burn fueling a vow. Meridian wouldn't just pay, they'd crumble. She wasn't a pilot anymore. She was a reckoning. Kara Jackson's world had shrunk to a razor's edge by her 3rd week at Meridian Airlines. At 34, she'd weathered storms in the sky and on the ground, but nothing matched the suffocating weight of this battle. The company's retaliation was relentless, grueling red-eye shifts to Las Vegas and back, barely enough rest to keep her sharp, and a rotating cast of captains who treated her like a rookie despite her 15,000 hours. Yet every slight, every smirk from Ed Carver's cronies only sharpened her resolve. She wasn't breaking. She was building. The evidence piling up in her apartment, Darius Holt's USB of doctor logs, Sophia Park's photos of neglected repairs, her own meticulous notes, formed a weapon more lethal than any storm she'd flown through. She moved through Meridian's headquarters like a shadow, her restricted badge a constant reminder of their leash, but her mind was free, plotting every step. Liam Tran, the 27-year-old first officer who'd stood by her since day one, became her eyes in the cockpit. "They're watching you closer now," he warned over coffee in the crew lounge, his youthful energy tempered by unease. "Langston's paranoid, thinks you're stirring trouble." Kara's lips curved faintly. "Good. Let him sweat." She needed allies, not just informants, and Liam was the first to sign on fully. "I'm with you, Captain," he said, voice firm. "This isn't right." Her chance to strike came with her first command since the Denver fiasco, a late-night run from Chicago to Vegas. A rowdy route notorious for drunk passengers and tight turnarounds. Liam was her co-pilot, a small mercy she suspected was no accident if Meridian wanted her to fail. They'd stacked the deck with a friendly witness. The pre-flight inspection set her nerves on edge. Scanning the maintenance log for the Boeing 737, Kara spotted gaps, oil pressure checks dated weeks apart, a hydraulic pump service overdue by 200 hours. She flagged it to the ground crew, a harried tech who shrugged. "It's within limits, Captain. Cleared by the book." Her gut screamed otherwise. "Not my book," she snapped, pulling on gloves to check the systems herself. Liam hovered nearby, nervous but supportive. "Dispatch is asking about the delay," he said as she ran diagnostics, her fingers tracing the controls. "Better late than dead," she replied, her voice iron. 20 minutes ticked by, a sin in Meridian's obsession with on-time stats. But she found it. A faint leak in the hydraulic line, small enough to miss but deadly at 30,000 feet. She filed a report, cleared the plane after repairs, and launched into the night sky, her jaw set. The flight landed smoothly, but the real turbulence hit back in Chicago. Victor Langston summoned her to his office at dawn, his 58-year-old frame radiating fury behind a mahogany desk. "You delayed Flight 889 over nothing," he growled, tapping a report with her name scrawled across it. "That little inspection cost us thousands." Kara stood tall, her uniform crisp despite the sleepless night. "I delayed it over a hydraulic leak that could have dropped us out of the sky," she countered. "FAA regs demand accurate logs, those weren't. I've flown 20 years, I know what holds a plane together." Langston's eyes narrowed, his voice dropping to a hiss. "At Meridian, we trust our maintenance teams, decades of expertise. If you can't, maybe you don't belong here." The threat hung like smoke. But Kara saw the trap. Back down or be branded a troublemaker. "Are you telling me to ignore safety violations?" she asked, slow and deliberate. "Put that in writing, Mr. Langston, and I'll follow it to the letter." His face flushed, a vein pulsing at his temple. "That won't be necessary," he spat. "Use better judgment next time." She nodded, rising. "I always do. Safety's my judgment." She walked out, his glare boring into her back, knowing she just crossed a line she couldn't uncross. That evening, Kara's alliances crystallized. Sophia Park met her in a dim corner of the employee parking lot, slipping her a thumb drive. More photos, cracked landing gear from a Miami flight last week. "They flew it anyway," she whispered, her eyes darting for watchers. "I can't keep quiet anymore." Kara gripped her shoulder. "You're not alone now." An hour later, Darius Holt waved her into the hangar's shadows, his 45-year-old frame tense. "They're falsifying more than logs," he said, voice barely audible over the hum of machinery. "Engine stress tests, downgraded to minor, when they should have grounded the birds. I've seen techs bullied into signing off." Kara's stomach churned. "How deep does it go?" Darius hesitated, then, "High enough." Langston's memos push quotas over fixes. And when Paul Decker pushed back, they made an example of him. He handed her a crumpled photo, Decker, smiling with his kids. Before the accident that ended his career. "I can't go public," Darius admitted, fear raw in his eyes. "3 kids, this job's all I've got." Kara nodded. "You don't have to." "I will." Back home, Kara called Nia, the clock ticking past midnight. "It's a machine, Nia," she said, spreading her evidence across the table. "Drives, photos, reports. They're risking lives for profit. And they've got blood on their hands already. Decker's just the start." Nia's voice crackled with focus. "We've got enough for the FAA, maybe the press. Send it all, I'll loop in my contact tomorrow. And Kara, dig into Decker's case. If it's not an accident, we've got them dead to rights." Kara hung up, staring at the chaos of proof before her. She thought of her father's mantra, "Flying's a sacred trust," and the passengers who'd never know how close they danced to disaster. Meridian wanted her compliant, invisible. Instead, she'd become their nightmare, a pilot with a conscience and the will to wield it. She plugged in the drives, her fingers flying over the keyboard, and whispered to the empty room. "You picked the wrong woman to bury." Kara Jackson stood at a precipice, the weight of 3 weeks at Meridian Airlines pressing against her like a gale at altitude. At 34, she built a career on precision and grit. But now she held something more dangerous than a cockpit yoke: the truth. Her apartment floor was a battlefield of evidence. Darius Holt's USB of falsified maintenance logs, Sophia Park's photos of cracked components, Liam Tran's whispered intel from the flight deck, and her own notes tracing a web of neglect that spanned 30% of Meridian's fleet. The bourbon she'd sipped the night before had burned away doubt. This wasn't just her fight. It was for every passenger who trusted their lives to a company that valued profit over safety. She'd endured their hazing, their threats, but no more. At 3 a.m., after Nia crashed on her couch mid-strategy session, Kara sat alone in the dark, her decision made. She dialed Nia's FAA contact. A gruff voice answering with sleepy suspicion. "You've got one shot to convince me, Jackson," he said. "Give me everything by noon, and I'll meet you tomorrow." Next, she called a Chicago Tribune reporter known for gutting corporate giants, planting seeds of a story too explosive to ignore. By sunrise, she was a woman possessed, her calm masking a storm ready to break. The day unfolded with a deceptive quiet. Kara reported for a scheduled flight to Boston, her first command since Vegas. With Liam as her co-pilot, a subtle nod of trust amid the chaos. The briefing room crackled with tension, word of her clash with Langston had spread. And the crew's eyes darted between curiosity and dread. As she reviewed the flight plan, Phil Grayson burst in, his check captain stripes gleaming with smug authority. "Change of plans, Jackson," he announced, voice loud for the audience. "I'm taking this one. Executive orders, weather's too dicey for a green captain." The sky outside was a pristine blue, the forecast flawless to Boston. Kara's pulse spiked, but she kept her cool. "Whose orders?" she asked, already knowing. "Langston's," Grayson sneered. "You're on desk duty, HR, now." The humiliation was a public gut punch. Liam's jaw tightening beside her, the flight attendants shifting uncomfortably. Kara gathered her papers with deliberate grace. "Safe flight," she said, her tone a blade sheathed in velvet, and walked out. Sophia Park caught her in the hall, fury in her whisper. "This is wrong." Kara squeezed her arm. "It's their last mistake." Sophia hesitated, then handed over a final photo, a fuel line patch with tape, dated yesterday. "Use it," she said. Kara nodded, the pieces locking into place. At HR, they stripped her of her pilot's badge, issuing a temporary one that locked her out of everywhere but a sterile office where she shuffled pointless forms. The busy work was meant to grind her down, but her phone buzzed with lifelines. "Liam. This is bullshit. How can I help?" "Darius. Meet me, hangar for 30. Big." Even Peter Lawson, Carver's timid co-pilot from Seattle, texted, "Not all of us are like them. Some of us still care." At 4:30, Kara slipped to the hangar's edge, where Darius waited, his 45-year-old frame hunched with nerves. "They're burying it all," he said, shoving a stack of printouts into her hands. "Internal memo, Langston's pushing to clear planes with known defects. Crash risk be damned." Kara skimmed it, her blood boiling. "Schedule trumps minor issues. Sign off or ship out." She met his eyes. "Will you testify?" Darius shook his head, voice cracking. "3 kids, Kara. I can't lose this." She clasped his shoulder. "You won't have to. I'll carry it." He nodded, a ghost of relief in his gaze, and melted back into the hangar's din. That night, Kara synced every file to Nia, who'd already drafted a report for the FA, 150 pages of damning proof. Falsified records, coerced sign-offs, Decker's accident tied to a whistleblower crackdown. "We've got them," Nia said over the phone, her voice electric. "FAA's on board, a full investigation if you pull the trigger. Tribune's ready too. Say the word." Kara exhaled. "Do it." At 2 p.m. the next day, she was summoned to the executive boardroom. A glass-walled cage where Victor Langston, Ed Carver, Phil Grayson, and 2 stone-faced lawyers waited. Langston didn't offer a seat. "You've been poking around restricted areas, Jackson," he said, his 58-year-old voice a coiled whip. "Soliciting intel, breaching confidentiality. Explain yourself." Kara stayed silent, letting him stew. "Resign now," a lawyer cut in, sliding a severance packet across the table with an NDA, "and you walk away clean. Refuse and we terminate you, insubordination, disruption. No airline will touch you." Langston smirked. Your call. Kara smiled a small lethal curve and set a recorder on the table. Before I choose, she said, pressing play, listen to this. Langston's voice crackled out. If we ground every plane for a check, the stock tanks. Let it fly, blame the pilots if it goes down. Recorded days ago, caught by a mic sheet hidden during a hallway rant. The room froze. Carver's fists clenching, the lawyers paling. At 9 a.m., she continued, my attorney hit the FAA with a report, your logs, your memos, your lies. At noon, the Tribune got it too, plus Decker's story. A third copy's locked away, set to hit every news outlet if anything happens to me or my sources. Langston's face drained of color. You're bluffing, he rasped. Kara leaned in. Try me. Ground every faulty plane now, call an independent audit, and protect my people, or I greenlight full exposure in 1 hour. Your empire's done either way. Carver slammed the table. This is blackmail. She met his glare unflinching. No, it's justice. The lawyers yanked Langston aside, whispering furiously. After 5 agonizing minutes, he croaked, we'll consider it. Kara stood. 58 minutes left. Tick-tock. She walked out, the recorder's weight in her pocket a victory heavier than gold. Kara Jackson's ultimatum hung over Meridian Airlines like a guillotine blade, its edge glinting with every tick of the clock. At 34, she'd stared down war zones and weather. But nothing matched the adrenaline surging through her as she stepped out of the executive boardroom, leaving Victor Langston, Ed Carver, and their lawyers scrambling in her wake. 58 minutes she'd given them that long to bend or break. She strode through O'Hare's terminal, her temporary badge a shackle she'd soon shed, and dialed Nia. It's done, she said. Voice steady despite the storm inside. Recordings live, FAA's rolling, Tribunes locked. They've got less than an hour. Mia's laugh crackled through the line, fierce and proud. They're toast, sis. FAA sending inspectors now, Tribunes dropping the story at 3 p.m. sharp. You're a damn legend. Kara's lips twitched, but her eyes stayed hard. Scanning the bustling crowds oblivious to the reckoning she'd unleashed. She'd lit the fuse, now she'd watch it burn. The explosion came fast. At 2:58 p.m., Meridian's headquarters erupted into chaos as the Tribune's headline screamed online, Meridian Airlines flew unsafe planes, silence whistleblowers. Kara's evidence, falsified logs. Sophia's photos of cracked valves, Darius's memos detailing Langston's quotas, spilled across the page, each word a hammer blow. By 3:15, TV screens in the terminal blared the story. Passengers gawking as footage showed FAA teams swarming Meridian's hangars. The company's response was a panicked press release, emergency maintenance review underway. Select flights grounded for safety. Nearly 40% of their fleet, dozens of planes, were yanked from service within hours, stranding thousands. Kara watched from a gateside cafe. A black coffee cooling in her hands as check-in lines dissolved into shouting matches and stock tickers flashed red. Meridian shares plunging 60% by close. Her phone buzzed relentlessly. Liam. Holy shit, you did it. Sophia. They're freaking out, thank you. Darius. Planes are down. You're safe, right? She texted back one word to each. Yes. The sky outside darkened with incoming snow. A fitting shroud for a dying giant. Langston's empire unraveled thread by thread. By nightfall, the FAA revoked Meridian's operating certificate, citing willful disregard for safety protocols. A death knell no airline could survive. Inspectors uncovered horrors Kara's evidence had only hinted at. Rusted landing gear bolts, engines patched with substandard parts, a 737 that had flown with a fuel leak for months. Former employees, emboldened by the collapse, flooded the press with stories. Mechanics coerced into silence. Pilots threatened for raising concerns. Decker's accident, now under criminal review. Langston, Carver, and Grayson were suspended pending investigation. Their faces splashed across news cycles as symbols of greed gone rotten. The board issued a groveling statement promising full cooperation and sweeping reforms, but it was too late. Bankruptcy loomed as creditors circled, and passengers boycotted what flights remained. Kara's inbox flooded. Offers from rival airlines, a safety consultant gig, even a book deal, but she stayed silent, letting the wreckage speak for her. 2 days later, she stood outside Meridian's headquarters, snow dusting her coat, watching workers pry the company's logo from the facade. The once proud eagle emblem clattered to the ground, leaving a faded outline on the wall, a ghost of hubris. Liam slid up beside her, his 27-year-old energy undimmed despite the chaos. Atlantic Airways is buying the scraps, he said, grinning. They're offering jobs to all certified staff except the suits, obviously. Senior first officer for me. You. Kara sipped her coffee, the bitterness grounding her. Still weighing options. Atlantic had called, dangling a captain's slot with a diversity pledge attached. But she wasn't ready to commit. The fallout wasn't over. That afternoon, Nia rang, breathless. Justice Department's filing charges: Langston, Carver, Grayson. Reckless endangerment, fraud, obstruction. Prison time's on the table. Kara closed her eyes, a weightlifting, not triumph, but closure. Good, she said. And the FAA's pushing a new safety committee, they want you on it. Kara glanced at the logo's wreckage. Tell them I'll think about it. The ripple effects hit the industry like aftershocks. Airlines nationwide launched internal audits, terrified of being the next Meridian. Whistleblower protections tightened, and Atlantic rolled out blind hiring skills over names to dodge the PR nightmare Kara had ignited. She'd changed the game. Not just for herself, but for every pilot who'd been told to shut up or get out. As she walked away from the ruined headquarters, her phone lit up with a text from Darius. Atlantic hired me. Head of Maintenance QC. Couldn't have done it without you. Sophia followed. Training for safety officer now. We won. Kara smiled, small but real. The cost had been brutal, sleepless nights, a career on the brink, but the wins mattered more. Planes grounded before they could fall, lives saved by voices too brave to stay silent. She'd started this war with Langston's sneer, get out there and wait, and ended it with his empire in ashes. The snow fell harder, blanketing Chicago in white, and Kara knew Meridian was dead. But her fight was just beginning. 3 months after Meridian Airlines' fiery collapse, Kara Jackson, now 34, sat in the cockpit of a Boeing 787 Dreamliner, guiding Atlantic Airways Flight 207 into the skies above Chicago. The 4 gold stripes on her sleeve caught the morning sun as the plane climbed through wispy clouds, carrying 243 passengers who'd placed their lives in her hands. Beside her, First Officer Aisha Brooks, a 29-year-old black woman with a steady gaze, monitored the instruments, her presence a quiet testament to the doors Kara had kicked open. Perfect day for flying, Kara said, her voice calm but warm, settling into the rhythm of command she'd fought to reclaim. Aisha nodded, then hesitated. Captain, I just want to say, what you did at Meridian. It's why I didn't quit when they told me I'd never make it. You're why I'm here. Kara glanced at her, a flicker of memory, Langston's sneer, Carver's threats, crossing her mind. The sky's ours, Aisha. She replied. Never let anyone tell you different. The plane leveled at cruising altitude, and Kara felt a rare peace settle in. She'd toppled an empire, but this flying clean, with a crew she trusted, was her truest victory. On the ground, Meridian's ghost lingered, a cautionary tale etched into aviation history. Atlantic Airways had swept in, buying the wreckage planes. Routes staff, minus the disgraced executives now facing trial. Langston, Carver, and Grayson sat in legal purgatory, their indictments for reckless endangerment and fraud splashed across headlines. The FAA's investigation had unearthed a cesspool, planes flown with cracked fuselages, maintenance budgets slashed to boost stock prices, Decker's accident, reclassified as suspected sabotage. Bankruptcy had gutted Meridian, but its fall sent shockwaves through the industry. Airlines scrambled to audit their fleets, terrified of a similar reckoning. Atlantic led the charge, implementing blind hiring, qualifications over demographics, and a whistleblower hotline with teeth, reforms Kara Stand had forced into being. She turned down their first offer, needing time to breathe, but when they came back with a captain's slot and a vow to prioritize safety, she'd signed on. The sky felt different now, still vast, still unforgiving, but less shadowed by greed. Kara's influence rippled beyond the cockpit. The FAA's new Aviation Safety Oversight Committee tapped her as a founding member. Her name synonymous with integrity after her congressional testimony, in aviation, truth isn't optional, it's survival. She'd spoken those words with a tremor in her voice but steel in her spine. Facing a room of suits who'd never known the barrier she'd shattered. Offers poured in, consulting gigs, speaking engagements, a memoir pitch, but she took her time, mentoring instead. Aisha was one of dozens. Young pilots from overlooked corners, Black, Latina, queer, sought her out, their dreams fueled by her defiance. Liam Tran, now 27 and a senior first officer at Atlantic, texted her updates, industries shaking, new safety regs dropping next month. You're doing. Darius Holt, rehired as Atlantic's head of maintenance quality control, sent photos of pristine engines. A quiet thank you for pulling him from Meridian's wreckage. Sophia Park, training as a safety officer, emailed, "You gave us a voice. We're louder now." Kara read each message, her chest tight with something fiercer than pride, purpose. The change wasn't flawless. Old biases lingered, subtle and stubborn, in boardrooms and crew lounges. Profit still clashed with precaution. And Kara knew the fight wasn't over. But progress had roots. Atlantic's Ops Center displayed a new quote on its wall, hers, from that testimony, "The sky doesn't forgive lies." She touched the frame once, a reminder of the day she'd found her strength, not just to defy but to reshape. That evening, as she logged her flight in the quiet hum of the center, Nia called. "Dinner tomorrow, big news," her sister teased. "Bring wine." Kara grinned, picturing Nia's smirk. "Your place. Red or white?" She hung up, gazing out at the tarmac where ground crews moved with purpose. No shortcuts, no tape on fuel lines. A plane lifted off, its lights fading into the night, and Kara felt it. Each takeoff was a win. A trust unbroken, a legacy of courage over complicity. Months later, an unexpected email jolted her. "Captain Jackson," it began, formal and stilted, from Phil Grayson. "After my community service, I've had time to reflect. Your stand forced me to face what I ignored. The industry's better for it. I'm sorry." Kara stared at the words, a tangle of emotions swirling. Not forgiveness, not yet. But a nod to change even in the unlikeliest hearts. She thought of her father, gone 2 years now, who'd beamed when she'd been vindicated, and of Aisha, now captaining her own flights. She typed back, "Apology noted, Grayson. The sky's for all of us." As she hit send, Kara leaned back, the weight of Meridian's fall a distant echo. She'd refused to wait outside that briefing room. And in doing so, she'd rewritten the rules not just for herself, but for every soul brave enough to soar. The horizon stretched wide, and she knew, her wings were still rising. 5 years after Meridian Airlines' ashes settled, Kara Jackson stood at the edge of a runway at Chicago's O'Hare, the wind tugging at her coat as a sleek Airbus A350 taxied past. Its Atlantic Airways livery gleaming under a slate-gray sky. At 39 now, her 4 gold stripes had weathered storms, literal and figurative, but they shone brighter for it, a badge of battles won. The industry she'd upended bore her mark. Safety audits were now relentless, whistleblower protections ironclad, and diversity no longer a buzzword but a bedrock. Atlantic had named her president of operational safety 2 years prior, the first black woman to hold such a role at a major airline, a title she'd earned not just by toppling Meridian but by mentoring a generation to fly without fear. She'd testified for stronger regulations, spoken at conferences about corporate accountability, and turned down glossy book deals to focus on the work, ensuring no plane took off with a lie in its logs. As the A350 roared into the air, Kara's gaze followed it, a faint smile tugging at her lips. That miracle of flight, metal-defying gravity, meant more now, cleansed of the shadows she'd banished. The world hadn't forgotten. Aviation magazines that once overlooked her now ran covers with her face, headlines like, "The Pilot Who Rewrote the Sky," tracing her path from that humiliating first day to Meridian's ruin. She kept one issue, not for vanity but for the hard days when progress stalled, when old attitudes crept back, when good enough tempted the industry to slack. On those days, she'd remember standing in that hallway, told to wait outside, and how she'd turned rejection into revolution. The memory fueled her still. She'd mentored dozens, hundreds. Maybe, pilots like Aisha Brooks, now a captain commanding transatlantic routes, and others from margins once ignored. Liam Tran, at 32, had risen to Atlantic's training division, texting her quips. "Still scaring the suit straight, Captain?" Darius Holt ran maintenance with a rigor that honored Paul Decker's sacrifice, while Sophia Park, a safety officer, led workshops on speaking truth to power. Their victories were hers, a constellation of light she'd sparked from Meridian's darkness. Change wasn't perfect. The industry still wrestled with profit's pull and biases subtle as runway fog persisted in quiet corners. But Kara saw the cracks widening, not with despair but with possibility. Atlantic's blind hiring had doubled minority pilots in 5 years, Their safety council, which she chaired, grounded planes without hesitation when red flags waved. Other airlines followed. Some grudgingly, but the tide had turned. One evening at Nia's cluttered apartment over a bottle of red, her sister dropped her big news from years back, a federal judgeship. Earned partly on the Meridian case's coattails. You gave me the ammo, sis, Nia grinned, raising her glass. To the Jackson women, breaking shit since '91. Kara laughed, clinking back. The warmth of family anchoring her. Later, she stepped onto Nia's balcony, Chicago's skyline glittering below, and thought of her father. He died before seeing her crowned, but she felt him in every safe landing, every pilot she lifted up. The 5th anniversary of Meridian's fall brought a quiet moment. Kara spoke at the Academy of Aviation Safety's gala, her words simple but searing. Sometimes the bravest thing is refusing to wait, outside a room, a dream, or a fight that needs you. The crowd, pilots, execs, regulators stood. Their applause a roar she hadn't sought but couldn't deny. Backstage, an aide handed her a note from a retired Phil Grayson, his handwriting shaky. Saw your speech on TV. You were right, the sky's bigger now. Thank you. She folded it away, not softened but struck by its weight. A crack in a wall she'd once thought impenetrable. The next day she flew again. A routine hop to San Francisco, the city where this all began with Langston's sneer. As the 787 pierced the clouds, Kara glanced at her co-pilot, a young Latino man, fresh from training. Eyes wide with awe. Your plane, she said, handing over the controls. He grinned and she leaned back watching him soar. That night, alone in her hotel room, Kara pulled out the magazine cover, her face stern, the headline bold, and traced its edges. She didn't need it anymore. The story lived in the skies she'd reclaimed and the pilots she'd raised. In the silence of planes that never fell. She set it aside, stepped to the window, and looked out at the Pacific's dark expanse, stars pricking the void. Meridian was a footnote now. A case study in ethics text, but Kara's tale stretched on flight by flight, truth by truth. The industry wasn't flawless, nor was she. But it was better, stronger, because she'd dared to break it and build anew. The horizon glowed faintly, dawn creeping in, and Kara smiled. She'd stopped waiting outside that day, and in doing so, she'd given the sky to everyone bold enough to claim it. Tomorrow she'd fly again, higher, freer, forever her own. Kara Jackson's journey didn't end with that San Francisco flight. It lives on in every plane that lifts off safely today, and every voice that refuses to be silenced tomorrow. Her story isn't just aviation history. It's a mirror for us all, reflecting the power of standing up when the world tells you to sit down. In our own lives, whether it's a job that overlooks us, a system that bends the rules, or a dream we're told to shelve, Kara reminds us, the horizon's only out of reach if we let it be. Courage isn't loud. It's steady, relentless. And it changes more than we imagine. So folks, if her fight stirred something in you, don't let it fade. Hit that subscribe button below and stick with us for more stories of grit and glory. The sky's full of them, and we're just getting started. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts and keep this journey soaring together.